Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Cropper here. I was asked a question by Mr. Jim Woods on my video about China. Why is it stalling? Why is its growth stalled? So he asks me, what's more likely, a Chinese civil war? Three scenarios. Chinese civil war is one. Strike against its sort of sphere of influence like Taiwan is option two. And option three, a strike against that outside of its sphere of influence. So just plain external belligerence. What do I find most likely in China's future? So I'll answer that after I talk about 5 precedences. 5 countries that came before China that did exactly what China's doing now and what they did, and then I think we'll have our answer. So all of the precedences that I'm going to mention are in the 1900s. They involve countries that weren't particularly wealthy, adopting the Western way of wealth, then going on the warpath. That's what they did in the 1900s. In the 1800s, you can look at Britain, France, Belgium, and what did they do when they adopted the industrial model of free economy and all the productivity that goes along with that. They also went out and conquered large territories. And Britain, for example, left in its wake large amounts of parliamentary governments. So I'm not sure that that was a bad thing, but we cannot, therefore, be instructed by the actions of governments in the 1800s. If we want to know what China's going to do, we have to look at government's actions in the 1900s, because that is the philosophy that prevails now. So, the precedents we will look at are Italy, Germany, Japan, Russia, and Islamofascism. Italy, 1922. 1921, fairly stable. 1922, fascism starts. Now, I think Mussolini took power in 22 and consolidated power over the next 3 or 4 years. But in order for him to take power, he actually had to have an armed coterie, his little group of 10 or 20,000 brown shirts that the police and the army couldn't or wouldn't stand up to. So there was internal civil war in that case. And it led to, eventually, the consolidation of power under one party that then made a strike externally, in this case against Eritrea, which was arguably within their sphere of influence. So that maybe still fits within that criteria. Then they go on the ultimate warpath, allying with Hitler and being a belligerent against a very large number of countries. There's Italy. It went through 3 stages. Civil war, strikes within its sphere of influence, strikes outside of its sphere of influence. Okay, Germany, 1932. Hitler takes power. By 1935-36, they are making strikes within their sphere of influence. I assume you know that Hitler taking power, he was voted in, but he was only voted in after having started his own private army and really done away with a lot of his opponents and been very careful about making his party grow. So there was civil war, followed by a strike within their sphere of influence against Austria, then Czechoslovakia, and then a strike against countries outside their influence. And if you don't count Poland as being outside of the influence of Germany, fine, it was inside the sphere of influence. Then the strike against France was outside of their sphere. So there they went through those 3 stages. Japan, the 1920s to 1938-39, when they sort of go on, in 41, December 7th, 41 is when they attacked the United States. They had been in war for a long time, and you can study the wars of Japan in the 1930s. They invaded Manchuria, I believe, in 35. So maybe it was earlier than that. Maybe a big key battle was in 35. I haven't studied it that much, of course. I'm more of a student of World War II itself, as most people are. But I do know that they had wars going on, and there must have been some internal strife. I know that there used to be the case that only samurais could own weapons. And the samurai kept their hair in a bun and everyone else had to grow their hair out long or something, or there was some way to tell. And then if you were caught with a sword, you were in big trouble, because only samurais could own swords. There was internal strife, there was dissension, there was holding down of one part of the population by the other. And that must have precluded, as it did in all of these other countries I'm going to talk about, it must have precluded the consolidation of power under the military clique that then was able to do its military expansionism. So Japan strikes out within its sphere of influence and then outside of its sphere of influence. Okay, Russia, 1920s was spent in civil war. Stalin takes power around 28, consolidates his power by 1932. In the 1930s, internal civil war and strife, internal belligerence, total elimination of tens of thousands of people in just a given arrest sequence. So over a couple of months in the summer of 38, 30 or 40,000 military personnel were arrested and killed. That's just over a couple of months. And this went on for years. And then, in the 1940s and 1939, so Russia's been striking inside its sphere of influence. It's had internal civil war, followed by strikes within its sphere of influence, and now it attacks Poland in 1939. So then striking outside of its sphere of influence. If Germany wouldn't have attacked Russia, Russia would have had Germany's back and helped it do all kinds of things, eventually walking over the top of Germany, and Germany knew that they had to attack. So there we go. Russia in the 1940s striking externally, and then all the way up through the 1970s striking out externally, trying to influence, take over other countries. In 1978 or 79, when they invaded Afghanistan, that became very real. Okay, one more precedent, and I think you're starting to see a pattern. Islamofascism. It has an internal, if we look at the Middle East as being broken up by the Western powers in the 1800s on through the early 1900s, we broke up and sort of built little states here and there. But if we look at the whole area as the Arab Islamic culture, then there is a civil war between Iraq and Iran, for example, as just one of the parts of that, and the internal strife and the discord eventually lead to power by one party in a certain area. Then there's going to be external strikes. So they did the internal part in the 1970s, in the 60s and 70s, up into the 80s, was the internal strife. But from the 1980s onwards, they had a unified place to do business where there wasn't internal strife. It was just plain bad guys, right? That was Afghanistan. We built the Taliban, trying to get Russia out of there. And then when Russia was gone, there were these mujahideen. So then, starting around the 90s, you get external attacks. And in 2001, that culminated in a very real way in September 11th. And from 2001 forward, we are looking at increasingly powerful and belligerent external attacks, if history is any gauge. What then is the future of China? Is it going to have internal civil war? Is it going to strike within its sphere of influence, or is it going to strike outside of its sphere of influence? Yes, the answer is it's going to have internal civil war, it's going to strike inside of its sphere of influence, and then it will be belligerent outside of its sphere of influence. So, what do we have to worry about then? Everything seems fine. Russia and China have very, very bad economic situations. Russia has built up $600 billion in foreign currency reserves. China has $3 trillion. But they are both spending it at a rate of about $1 billion every 8-hour shift. So what that comes down to is about $100 billion a month. Every 8-hour shift that somebody does in one of those banks, they see $1 billion in foreign currency reserves go out, on average. So what are they going to do with all this massive money that they've spent the last decade and a half of free trade and relatively free economies, building up all this wealth. What are they going to do with it? Squander it. And part of it's being spent on military, and that part is the part we have to worry about. They, luckily, for our sake, they do not get to spend all of their hard-earned money and all their saved money. They are flushing it down the toilet with stupid economic policies. Unluckily for us, they did buy a lot of military equipment. They do have factories that are continuing to produce this equipment, and they are going to short-circuit into violence if history is any indication at all. So, there we have the answer.